It was a gray morning in Normandy, 1944. The fields were quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that only follows after chaos. Smoke lingered low over shattered hedgerows. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the air, mixing with damp earth and blood. And there, among the wreckage of war, stood a British officer with calm, almost unnerving composure. Colonel James Ashford, tall, uniform immaculate despite the mud, looked across a field strewn with the remains of a German convoy. Moments earlier, those same soldiers had fought fiercely against his men. Now one of them, a young German lieutenant no older than 24, lay on the ground trembling, his face pale with fear. Ashford walked toward him. His men expected orders to secure the prisoner, perhaps even interrogation. Instead, the colonel did something that made every soldier watching freeze in disbelief. He extended his hand. "Come with me," he said quietly. "You look like you could use a cup of tea." The German hesitated, confused, exhausted, unsure whether this was mercy or mockery. But Ashford meant it. Within the hour, the German prisoner was sitting inside a small farmhouse, hands still shaking, staring at the chipped porcelain cup placed in front of him. Outside, artillery thundered in the distance. Inside, two enemies, men born to hate each other, sat across a wooden table sharing silence and the warmth of tea. It wasn't a truce, not even close. The war still raged beyond those walls. But in that fleeting moment, something extraordinary happened. A spark of humanity in a time designed to erase it. What drove a British commander to invite his enemy to tea? Was it mercy, duty, or something deeper? A desperate need to remember what it meant to be human amid the ruins of war? This is the story of one brief encounter that defied the very logic of World War II, where compassion crossed battle lines, and a simple cup of tea became an act of quiet rebellion. By the summer of 1944, Europe had become a graveyard of cities and ideals. The Allied invasion of Normandy was in full motion. Villages once filled with laughter now echoed with the groan of tanks and the whine of aircraft cutting through the clouds. The British Army had landed weeks earlier, pushing through hedgerows and minefields, facing a determined German defense that refused to break easily. Colonel James Ashford had been in France since the first days after D-Day. He was not a man built for glory. He was quiet, deliberate, and often found writing letters instead of boasting about victories. His men said he carried the weight of every casualty in his eyes. To them, he was a soldier who still believed in rules, in dignity, even when the world seemed to have lost it. Before the war, Ashford had been a history professor in Oxford. He taught about diplomacy, the fall of empires, and the fragile threads that connected nations. But those ideas felt ancient now, buried beneath rubble and blood. Still, somewhere within him, that scholar's conscience remained alive. A voice that whispered that war might destroy armies, but it didn't have to destroy decency. The German forces they fought in that region were mostly young, boys drafted from shattered schools and small towns across Bavaria and Saxony. The Reich was desperate. Its manpower stretched thin. These weren't hardened killers. Many were barely men, holding rifles that felt heavier than their convictions. Among them was Lieutenant Karl Brenner, the young officer captured that day. Brenner had grown up in Munich, the son of a baker. His father fought in the Great War and returned home with a wooden leg and a silence that lasted 20 years. Karl's childhood was steeped in patriotism, fear, and hunger. A generation raised to believe obedience was survival. By 1944, he had seen more death than he could comprehend. When his unit was surrounded by British troops near the village of Tilly-sur-Seulles, Karl had ordered his men to surrender, but not before a brief firefight left several of them dead. The British were victorious, but the cost was steep. Among the casualties was one of Ashford's sergeants, a close friend since North Africa. Any other commander might have taken the surrender coldly, maybe even cruelly. War hardened most men that way, but Ashford did something that baffled his company. He told his men to treat the prisoners with respect, to ensure the wounded were cared for, and to bring Karl Brenner to him personally. When they stood face to face, Karl expected interrogation, maybe humiliation. Instead, Ashford saw not an enemy, but a reflection. A weary young man following orders in a war neither had chosen. "Do you speak English?" the colonel asked. Karl nodded faintly. "A little." Ashford looked at him for a long moment, then said almost softly, "Good. Then you'll understand me when I say this. The war will end one day. And when it does, may neither of us forget that we were men before we were soldiers." That was when he invited him for tea. The gesture seemed absurd to everyone who heard about it later, as if kindness itself had become a form of rebellion. But for Ashford it wasn't about sympathy for the enemy. It was about reminding his own men that mercy didn't make them weak. By that evening, the farmhouse they used as headquarters had become the stage for one of the strangest meetings of the war. A British commander and a German officer, two men divided by language, ideology, and bloodshed, would soon share a table, not as victors and captives, but as humans. Outside, the world continued to burn. But inside that farmhouse, for a brief and fragile moment, the war paused. The following afternoon, the farmhouse buzzed with disbelief. Word had spread through the British ranks, the colonels having tea with a German prisoner. Some laughed, others scoffed. A few called it madness, but Ashford didn't care. He was a man guided by quiet principles rather than public approval. He had spent the morning writing in his leather notebook, the same one he carried since North Africa. His entries were never about tactics or victories. They were about humanity. The things he feared might disappear if men forgot to feel. When Karl Brenner entered the room, two guards stood at the door. His uniform was torn, his left arm bandaged, his face hollow from exhaustion. He had been offered food earlier, but refused. Pride, perhaps, or confusion. Ashford noticed the tremor in his hands. The sort that doesn't come from fear alone, but from everything that leads up to it. "Sit," Ashford said calmly. "You've been through enough." The guards exchanged glances but obeyed when the colonel waved them away. What remained was silence, the kind that feels almost sacred. Ashford poured 2 cups of black tea, strong and bitter. "Sugar?" he asked. Karl blinked. "Please." As the tea steamed between them, Ashford studied the young man's eyes. They weren't cruel. They were simply tired. The same eyes he had seen in his own men after too many battles, too many burials. "You're from Munich?" Ashford began. "Yes, my father was a baker." Karl's English was halting, uncertain. "Then you must miss bread that isn't made of ration flour," Ashford said with a faint smile. That line, simple, human, broke the wall between them. Karl smiled almost against his will. "Yes, it is." Terrible now. The conversation was awkward at first. Each word tested a fragile truce. They spoke of weather, of fields, of how similar the French countryside looked to southern Germany. Then, slowly, the topics shifted. To loss, to duty, to the absurdity of a war that had turned men into enemies by accident of birth. Karl finally said, "I did not want this war, Colonel. None of us did. But what choice did we have?" Ashford nodded. "None of us truly did. Orders are the easiest refuge for the guilty." For a moment neither spoke. Outside, the distant thud of artillery rolled like thunder across the horizon. Each explosion was a reminder that their fragile peace existed only within those thin stone walls. Ashford's adjutant, Captain Willis, entered quietly and hesitated. "Sir, Major Harding wishes to speak to you. He's concerned about—" He paused, eyeing Karl. "Protocol." Ashford looked up sharply. "Protocol can wait. Tell Harding I'm occupied." Willis nodded stiffly and left, closing the door. Karl lowered his eyes. "Your men will not like this." "They don't have to," Ashford said. "War makes beasts of men. Someone must remember how to stay human." There it was, the core of Ashford's defiance, not rebellion against command, but against what the war demanded of the soul. Later that day, Harding confronted him outside the farmhouse. "James, for God's sake, you're fraternizing with the enemy. What if command finds out?" Ashford answered evenly. "Then perhaps command will remember what the word civilization means." Harding shook his head. "He'd have shot you without hesitation if you'd been on the other side." "Maybe," Ashford replied. But then it would be his burden to live with, not mine. The two men stared at each other, soldiers divided not by rank or side, but by what war had done to their hearts. Inside, Karl sat alone for a moment, staring at his reflection in the tea's surface. He thought of his brother, dead outside Stalingrad, and the letter he never sent to his mother. The enemy across from him had shown more mercy than many of his own officers. It was a strange kind of pain, the realization that kindness could wound deeper than cruelty. When Ashford returned, Karl stood. "Colonel, may I ask, why me?" Ashford looked at him quietly. "Because if I forget that you're a man, I'll forget that I am one too." The German's eyes filled, though he quickly blinked it away. He was a soldier, after all, trained not to feel. As dusk fell, the two men shared one last cup. Outside, the sky burned orange, streaked with smoke from distant fires. The war felt endless, but for that single evening, they were no longer enemies. When the guards finally escorted Karl back to the holding area, he turned once at the doorway. "Danke, Herr Colonel." Ashford simply nodded. "Good night, Lieutenant." That night, Ashford's men whispered among themselves. Some thought their commander had gone soft. Others, though they wouldn't say it aloud, felt something stir. A strange pride that maybe, just maybe, decency still had a place in hell, and so, in a war that devoured compassion, one man dared to remember it. 2 days later, the British regiment prepared to advance toward Caen. Orders were clear: push forward, secure the bridge, and expect fierce German resistance. Ashford's men were tired but disciplined. The fighting ahead promised to be brutal, a continuation of the same nightmare they had lived since landing on the beaches. The morning began with fog, thick and heavy, the kind that made the world feel smaller. Trucks rumbled, rifles clanked, and the low growl of engines merged with distant thunder. The air smelled of oil and fear. Inside the farmhouse, Ashford packed his maps and folded his notes with practiced precision. As he turned to leave, Captain Willis entered, pale and uneasy. "Sir, you'll want to hear this. The prisoners. They're being transferred to command custody this morning, including the German lieutenant." Ashford paused. "Brenner?" "Yes, sir." "The convoy leaves in half an hour." For a long moment Ashford said nothing. Then he nodded and walked toward the makeshift holding area behind the orchard. The guard stiffened as he approached, saluting awkwardly. Karl Brenner was already standing by the truck, wrists bound, face grim but calm. When he saw the colonel, he straightened instinctively. "Lieutenant?" Ashford greeted. "I see you're leaving us." Karl gave a small, tired smile. "Yes, back to the cages, I suppose." Ashford gestured to the guards to give them a moment. They stepped back reluctantly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. A folded envelope. "Here," Ashford said. "I took the liberty of writing a note to the Red Cross. They can help you send word to your family once you reach the camp." Karl stared at it, hesitant. "Why are you doing this, Colonel?" "You owe me nothing." Ashford met his gaze. "No, but someday someone will do the same for my son if he's captured. Decency has to start somewhere." The young German swallowed hard. His eyes flicked to the envelope again, as if the paper itself carried weight beyond words. "Thank you," he murmured. As the trucks rumbled to life, Karl climbed aboard. The engines drowned out everything, the voices, the footsteps, even the war for a moment. But then, above the noise, Karl leaned slightly out of the truck and said, in broken English, "If we were not soldiers, I think we could have been friends." Ashford smiled faintly. "Perhaps in another world, Lieutenant. One without uniforms." The truck jolted forward, wheels grinding against the dirt road. The German prisoners faded into the mist, swallowed by distance and war. Ashford stood there long after the convoy disappeared, the morning wind tugging at his uniform. He felt something in his chest, a strange emptiness, as though he had just lost someone he never truly knew. By afternoon, the regiment moved out. The attack began under a pale sun that barely broke through the clouds. Mortar fire thundered across the valley, shells bursting like tearing fabric. The earth trembled beneath every explosion. Ashford led from the front, calm as always, shouting orders through the chaos. His men trusted him blindly. Halfway across the field, a mortar struck near his position. The blast threw him to the ground, ears ringing, dirt filling his mouth. When he blinked the dust away, he saw two of his men dragging him to cover. Blood soaked his sleeve. The pain came slowly, like realization. They carried him back to the farmhouse, the same place where he'd once shared tea with the enemy. Medics worked frantically. Somewhere in the haze, Ashford heard voices. Then silence. When he awoke, the room was dim, lit by the soft glow of lanterns. A nurse bent over him, whispering, "You're lucky, sir." The shrapnel missed the artery. Ashford tried to sit up, but pain anchored him down. His gaze wandered to the table beside his bed. And there, untouched, sat two empty teacups. The same ones from that strange afternoon. Someone had placed them there, maybe as a joke, maybe as remembrance. He stared at them for a long time. One cup chipped, one cracked, neither perfect, both real. Outside, the guns never stopped. But inside that quiet farmhouse, Ashford smiled faintly through the pain. He thought of Karl Brenner, somewhere on a train bound for a prison camp, clutching an envelope, maybe still remembering the tea, the conversation, the moment that had no place in war. The world had gone mad, but in that madness, a flicker of sanity remained. Two men, enemies by command, humans by choice, and as Ashford drifted into sleep, the thought returned again and again, soft as prayer. If compassion could survive here, perhaps peace could too. Months passed. The war trudged toward its exhausted end. Cities fell, empires cracked, and Europe began to imagine peace again. A word that had almost lost its meaning. Colonel James Ashford survived Normandy. His injuries healed, though the limp stayed with him for life. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, he returned to England a decorated man, ribbons on his chest, but a silence behind his eyes that medals could never fill. He went back to Oxford, to the same classroom where he once lectured on diplomacy and the fragile web of human decency. Students said he spoke softly, sometimes drifting into pauses as if haunted by the ghosts of those he'd commanded. Yet every year he began his first lecture with the same line: "War teaches us how to destroy, but only memory teaches us how not to repeat it." Among the few things he kept from France was that small chipped teacup. It stayed on his desk until the day he retired. Most people assumed it was just a keepsake. Few knew the story behind it. Years later, in 1951, a letter arrived at his Oxford address. The handwriting was careful, foreign. The return name read Karl Brenner. Ashford opened it slowly, the past rushing back with every line. "Colonel Ashford, I am alive. I was released from the camp 2 years ago and returned to Munich. My father did not survive the bombings, but my mother lives. I work now as a teacher. I wanted to tell you, I never forgot the day you offered me tea. It was the first time in that terrible war I felt human again. I kept your letter to the Red Cross. It reminded me that compassion is not weakness. With respect, Karl Brenner." Ashford read it twice, then placed it beside the teacup on his desk. For a long while he said nothing. Then quietly he smiled. History would never record that meeting. There were no headlines, no statues, no medals for kindness. The war's chronicles were filled with battles and numbers, not moments of mercy. Yet between two men from opposite sides, a single act of civility had survived when so much else had perished. When Ashford died in 1963, the chipped teacup was found beside the letter, still folded neatly. His nephew later donated both to a small regimental museum. The curator placed them under glass with a simple inscription: "Objects recovered from Normandy, 1944. Proof that even in war, humanity endures." Visitors rarely lingered there long. Most didn't grasp what the items meant. But for those who did, veterans, historians, wanderers, that quiet display said more than any uniform or medal ever could. Because in a century defined by destruction, one British commander and one German prisoner proved something timeless: that a small act of compassion can echo louder than the roar of war itself. And in the silence that followed, the world, weary, broken, rebuilding, remembered, if only for a moment, that even enemies could share tea.